So I'm Andy Winkler. I'm the director of BPC's Housing and Infrastructure Project. I also lead our Disaster Response Reform Task Force. Thank you to all of you here in the room and watching us online. This is a conversation that we've wanted to have here at BPC for quite a while, to talk about the Federal Emergency Management Agency, all that it's tasked with, its mission and its future. And I could think of three gentlemen, no one better to have this conversation with, people who have led the agency, who know exactly what its challenges are, and who have seen, between the three of them, nearly every type of hazard and disaster that our nation has faced, including some of our nation's largest, most costly disasters in recent memory. So before I introduce our very esteemed panelists, I just want to extend my thanks, number one, to all of you for joining us here today, to the Walmart Foundation, JPB Foundation, who support our task force. And without that support, we wouldn't be able to relaunch last year and do the work that we do and have conversations like this. I'm personally very grateful. And then we have a lot of our task force members here in the room. It's a bipartisan group of emergency managers, disaster recovery experts. Some have traveled very far across the country to be here today to support us, and I'm very grateful. So one quick kind of housekeeping thing too, if you're joining us online, please do submit your questions at any time via the YouTube chat. Also, we'll have about 15, 20 minutes at the end of the program today to answer any questions here in the room as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce first, Mr. Gaynor, our esteemed task force co-chair. Pete joins us after having been acting secretary of DHS, FEMA administrator, deputy FEMA administrator, Rhode Island emergency manager, Providence emergency manager director, and many, many years in the Marine Corps. Brock Long, who also was a FEMA administrator, as well as having served a couple of stints at FEMA, previously at FEMA, as well as the Alabama Emergency Management Agency as director, and the Georgia Emergency Management Agency, among other jobs, and of course is now the executive chairman of Haggerty Consulting. And then last but not least, Jeff Byard, who is the former associate administrator of FEMA, as well as having served also at the Alabama Emergency Management Agency, and does some great work as VP of Operations at Team Rubicon, which, if you are not familiar, is a fantastic nonprofit that mobilizes our nation's veterans to help in emergency response. So that's a quick version of your resumes. You are all very impressive people, far more than I. And I want to say just one thing before we jump straight into the questions. Having talked about this event, it was really important to us to convey, this is a conversation about policy, about what we task FEMA with as policymakers. All of these gentlemen are incredibly quick to sing FEMA's praises, particularly the praises of its workforce, which is often tasked with the impossible every day, in and out. This is a conversation not about them necessarily, but about what are the tools that they need to do their jobs as best as they possibly can. So I think that's important to say. Our emergency managers are asked the impossible every day. They put their lives on hold to go travel to places that are sometimes dangerous or certainly far from home, and asked to do a lot. So just wanted to say that before we get started. So I was hoping, just to kind of kick us off, that we could turn it to each of you to sort of just talk in your mind about some of the biggest challenges facing FEMA. And I know it's a big question. We could just have that as the prompt for the rest of the conversation, but let's start there with exactly what you think are kind of those biggest order priorities for the agency moving forward. We can start with you, Pete, and go down the line.
So the past, 10 or 12 years has been a parade of never-ending hurricanes and national disasters, COVID, I think the nation has found the value of emergency managers not only at the federal level, but at the state and local level. And they found that value during COVID, where emergency managers were asked to do non-traditional things like manage a public health emergency, not really in the job jar of emergency managers, but now it is. And it seems that these emergency managers, from the bottom to the top, have become the nation's problem solvers, some of the hardest problems. And so, yes, we're going to continue to solve the nation's hurricanes and natural disasters and all those kind of responses and recovery. But the nation's going to continue to ask us to do things that are not typically traditional missions, right? So whether it's Afghan resettlement or MPOX, or the list goes on and on and on, I think emergency managers from the top to the bottom, to include FEMA, have to be ready to do things that they had not contemplated before. And for those that are not familiar with FEMA, I think the standard bumper sticker is 20,000 employees, which is technically true. But if you divide that down a little bit, it's a little bit over 5,000 full-time employees at FEMA, which is not a lot. And the rest are really valuable reservists and core employees. Not a lot of bandwidth there just for the traditional disasters that we serve and respond to. But now you're going to add all this other requirements onto the plate. So I think the problem is if you want FEMA and emergency managers across the nation to do more, you have to fund them, you have to staff them, you have to kind of relook at what policies they have traditionally have, and maybe what policies, laws, and statutes that they need to operate more freely. So again, I think it's going to be constricted and a high demand on a small amount of people at the federal level and across the country.
So I think, one, I always caveat this, I'm very passionate about emergency management. And if you don't understand the definition of passion, it's the right mix of love and anger. I love the field. I'm angry about the framework in which emergency managers have to operate in, because I do believe, and you're never going to hear the three of us ever say anything negative about the FEMA workforce, because they are unfairly treated and scapegoated, and they watch over half the globe from Tinian and Saipan all the way to the U.S. Virgin Islands. And their job is getting more and more complex, particularly as other federal government agencies aren't doing their job. And more and more problems are being thrown on FEMA's plate. It's a very small agency. And I don't necessarily believe that a bigger FEMA is going to be the answer to all of our questions, but emergency management is a team sport, and we do have to look at what are the capabilities not only at the local and state level, but how are we instilling tangible skills within our citizenry and educating them on financial resilience, the importance of insurance, or how to do CPR. And so I grow frustrated that the employees at FEMA are forced into this box, and I feel like the profession has become, it's worked well. We have the greatest emergency management, concept on the planet, hands down. We've made it more complex than it needs to be. And I think some of it's because of piecemeal legislation that comes in after something bad happens. We want to reform FEMA, we want to reshape things, those types of things. But I do believe that, like, the disaster declaration process is like a rusty old bicycle that we keep strapping new parts to. And it's time that frame's going to crack, and it needs to change.
All right. Well, look, first let me say thank you to Andy and everybody for being here today. I am the Vice President of Operations domestically for Team Rubicon. We don't use the word nonprofit. That's a tax indicator. We're a for-impact organization. We provide a lot of impact across the country. We also are a global organization. So what that's done for me is give me an opportunity to see other countries and other areas of the world and how they operate. And, I always look at opportunities and I always find the positive. And we are the world leader in emergency management, from response to recovery, from the local to the state to FEMA. We actually teach it worldwide. So, when they say, think out of the box, let's don't forget that the box is pretty good, and as both of the administrators pointed out, FEMA and all the emergency managers solve a lot of problems. So I always look at, what if we could, give them a little more tools? What if we give them a little more, effort to do that? But the question, I think there's a couple of challenges that FEMA face. One, let's just call it out, it's fatigue. the team's tired. They were tired when we were there, and they didn't get a break when we left, and they didn't have a break before we got there. So I think fatigue is going to be something that, and retaining that talent at FEMA is going to be something that's a challenge, not unlike probably all the organizations that you represent. And then mission creep. What is going to be the true mission of FEMA? It was founded to really respond to the catastrophic events that our country will face. That's way back in the early days of FEMA. But now it is an agency that, as Pete alluded to, that, hey, it doesn't fit here, it doesn't fit there, call the FEMA administrator. He or she will figure out a solution. And I go back to my opening statement. They figured that solution out. So I think fatigue and mission creep are going to be two challenges that FEMA will face moving forward.
I want to stick on the mission creep, because we have talked a lot about, and it's not necessarily, to your point, FEMA's fault, but in a disaster, it exposes all of the vulnerabilities that existed in a community before it. Whether it's a lack of affordable housing, whether it's aging infrastructure, an old water system, a disaster makes it worse when we're talking about a wildfire or a hurricane or anything else. And so I think by its very nature, we're trying to fix a lot of those upstream problems in a disaster, emergency, post-disaster setting. And so to your point, that's created over time more and more of a mission for FEMA, an overlapping mission with other federal agencies, and we've created a complicated system. There's no way around that. Is it effective? Often, yes, but it's complicated. And so there have been tons of different proposals. Do you move FEMA out of DHS? Do you establish some new coordinating body to help it operate between federal family better? In your mind, and maybe we start with you, Brock, what actually could be effective in narrowing that mission and defining it and setting everybody up for success?
If I could have one conversation right now with anybody, it'd be Jimmy Carter. What was the intent of FEMA when it was formed? And I believe that he would probably say it was a disaster relief agency, not a long-term community disaster recovery agency that does all things. And what is that right balance? I can tell you that the agency is not properly outfitted to do everything that it's doing. And a lot of mission creep, when I say mission creep, I really believe that after COVID, HHS and the ASPR piece should be armed more heavily to handle the breakdown in hospital systems and not FEMA. We saw 67 hospitals collapse in Puerto Rico, and that bag was put on my plate. It's not the Federal Electricity Management Agency. We shouldn't be rebuilding power grids. We're doing all of these things well outside of our expertise. And like Jeff said, we will figure it out and get it done. But I do believe, too, that the framework in which FEMA is operating in, the old disaster declaration process doesn't help them overcome new and emerging threats. And from cyber attacks or ships hitting bridges or BP Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion that we got to manage in Alabama. And I wonder, what if you threw the whole concept out in its entirety? And you throw out the politics of whether it was declared or it wasn't declared. If a state or local government truly has had their capacity exceeded and has the need, then what if we set up a cost share system with the rules ahead of time to say, here's how this is going to go, and you take the politics out of the disaster declaration process immediately going forward? Because I do believe FEMA should be a politically neutral organization, and I've learned that hurricanes don't discriminate between Republicans and Democrats, right? And I think that, it should be, there needs to be an evaluation of properly building it. The funds they're too complex. We had to ask for funding 3 times to the DRF in 2 years. That money went to 20 different federal government agencies to fund over 91 different recovery programs. There's not a recovery program a plan in this country that is remotely indicative of what goes on after a big disaster strikes. And we're wanting to strap more to it. We got to do this program, we got to do that program. Well, FEMA doesn't have the bandwidth and the threshold to continue managing more and more and more. How do you consolidate those grant funds and get it down to something that a mayor in any community can understand without having to hire consulting firms to come in and do it for me, right? I'll work myself out of a job here.
Pete, you want to pick up on that? What you think the priority should really be?
Yeah. The problem is there's lots of priorities, right?
Yep.
And there's the priorities of today, immediately. Like that is the overriding FEMA priority, right? When we have time, we'll think about the future, but there's not a lot of time to do that. I think that's part of the problem. I think, and my perspective is generally from COVID. I think so. Whether you're a local or state or federal, if you have emergency in your title, people call you when there's an emergency, right? I think that's kind of where people lead to. And I try to tell people that, I'm the head of whatever, right? The federal government or the state emergency, but I'm the coordinator of an emergency. I'm not responsible for the entire emergency. I coordinate the entire width and breadth of government to solve the emergency. And I think what we don't have, and specifically at the federal level, we don't have a national crisis strategy, right? That is integrated across government, and FEMA is not the ad hoc. Hey, oh, by the way, we should call FEMA on this, and you figure out that the entity that has the responsibility is ill-equipped for it, and therefore we do what we do. We solve those problems. So I think we need a national crisis strategy that lays out, should something cross a threshold, right? Something out of the ordinary, out of the normal Stafford Act responsibilities, that this is how we're going to respond as a nation. Now, is FEMA the center of that? I don't know. Maybe not. But I think we lack a strategy to really use the entire power of the government. And I think it helps with some of the burnout, right? That it's just not FEMA doing it all the time. It's really the entire government doing it all the time.
But there's no incentive to do the right thing. There's the whole disaster declaration process does not reward people for implementing land use planning, building codes, or having proper insurance in place. The whole system and many disasters are declared because of uninsured public infrastructure losses. Well, one, why is it uninsured? Okay. Two, why is that the main factor in approving a majority of disaster declarations? I mean, that's the unspoken, what we don't want to talk about. It's a moral hazard, right? And so, one, how do you start to incentivize communities that do the right thing? Maybe they should pay a lower cost share. Maybe that, there's different things that we can do to incentivize good behavior as we fight a changing climate or emerging threats, right?
And I think it was priority was the question.
Yep.
Really easy. The disaster survivor. That should be the priority.
Yeah.
If it's not, why are you doing it? So I think FEMA's priority should be disaster survivors. And what can they do to support the local level? All disasters are local. COVID was local. We didn't notice that because you would see Pete on stage at the White House, and I know that guy, but it's local. And I think that if we lose that focus, if we get tied up into, a lot of complicated policy stuff that's really important, but if we're not doing policy to better the delivery of aid to a disaster survivor, to me, it's just words on paper. Why do it? It's just a waste of time.
And the key is simplicity, and I think that's what we lack, right? It's overly complicated because you have years and years of disaster on a disaster, recovery on recovery. No two disasters are the same, so no two solutions are the same. And again, you're absolutely right. It is about the disaster survivor, but I think that the overriding goal is we have to make it as simple as possible because we can't make it any more complicated because it just doesn't get better.
Yeah.
Well, so to pick up on that point, right? Both of you mentioned this over time, and we've had a couple big FEMA reform bills, all after significant disasters, intended to fix things that were exposed during that recovery, that response, but they've added bureaucracy on bureaucracy. How do we, recognizing that the goal here is to simplify, particularly for the disaster survivor, their family, their household, make it easier for communities to respond. How do you get Congress, how do you get policymakers to think about doing that without just adding?
Well, I have a question.
Yep.
Has there been a reform in public health after COVID?
No.
All right. Switching gears. Switching gears.
Is that a mic drop?
Is this where we go off the rails?
The camera. No.
We clock it at 20 minutes?
No, but we could break this down. I mean, there's a couple things. Like, there's good and bad pieces of all the legislation that's been pushed forward since we've been involved. Like, Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act proves that emergency managers get fired for two things. They failed in response logistics, or they fouled up millions of dollars in recovery. Nobody's going to fire you for a pathetic mitigation or community resilience plan. Okay, that incentive needs to change, right? And then it really aided FEMA in being able to respond because we learned we cannot fail in response. But we built this massive response capability at the federal level, and it only modestly or didn't even keep up at the local and state level. And then again, we're not giving true tangible skills to our citizen education programs, right? PCMRA, but the problem with PCMRA, in my opinion, is the way that it sets up. It says that the FEMA administrator has a direct line to the President of the United States when there's a disaster. That's every day. 220 events, wildfires declared disasters in 2 years, I think is what I went through. A new disaster or wildfire declared every 3 days. Is that a direct line to the President, or should I report to the Secretary of Homeland Security? And and it depends on how the administrations manage, Homeland Security as to whether or not you spend a lot of your time back briefing everybody, or making decisions and having everybody in your business as you're making decisions or not, right? The Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, one of the things that it set up, if I remember correctly, was 428, Section 428 of the Stafford Act, which is beautiful. It is outcome-driven recovery. It says, if we have all of this roadway damage, instead of writing an individual project worksheet for that pothole, that break, that washed away road or whatever, what if we could estimate the cost for all of it and write one project worksheet and be done with it in 4 years and not continue to cut checks for project worksheets over 10 years. I mean, I was in office still cutting checks to Louisiana for Katrina in 2017-18. Okay, so how do you reduce the time, but you get outcome-driven recovery? You're focused on that up front, not just reversioning project worksheets for the next 10 years, right? And then the DRRA, the biggest thing, and then I'll shut up. The biggest thing was the not just the BRIC grant, which was designed to specifically, the intent of that was to protect our nation's infrastructure. I don't care what the hazard and risk and vulnerabilities are anymore. I care about the infrastructure that's got to be working in your community, that if it's not working, people are dying or life routine is disrupted. And if we can identify that and who owns it, then we better be mitigating it, right? And we spend a lot of time on this threat hazard identification risk assessment stuff, which is great, and that's a part of it. But we better be figuring out the logistics that needs to be working and everything else, right? And then the other thing was, because FEMA is such a small organization, the 5% management cost in the DRRA allows state and local governments to hire their own force account labor or consulting firms to come in and manage a process that they are not equipped to do. They don't have the grant administrators. They don't have the workforce there. And so I think that FEMA's got to be able to promote that 5% management cost as a force multiplier to their Army and not just outfitting FEMA with more staff, right?
So, I hate the word fix. I would guard against that, because when you come in and say, we're going to fix this or fix that, I believe that all good acts are done by good people with good intentions at that time. So you need to adjust it. But the challenge is we supported the Disaster Simplification Act, right? One application. You ask any disaster survivor, and they're going to say, yeah, we want that. Well, it can't get passed. So, we can't get a simple thing passed, and I'm not an expert in that side of the world, but I don't see how you would think a comprehensive package would even move out of committee. So, I think there's a lot more challenges on that end of D.C. I think I'm pointing the right way. I hadn't been here in a couple
Yep.
years, but than a disaster reform piece. But I can tell you, Andy, whether it's a big package or even a little chunk, if it's going to make life better for a disaster survivor or a state or local emergency manager, or put more capability to bring on expertise, I think that's a positive thing. So you kind of got to get it how you get it and make it work when you get it.
Yep.
So.
Pete, anything to add on sort of the strategy of getting even some of these smaller fixes, like a unified disaster application?
I think all the big post-disaster reform bills are all well-intentioned to fix things that were obviously broken, right? And some important, some mildly important, and maybe some that don't really have an effect. But I think it's all well-intentioned by well-intentioned people to make the system better, again, for the disaster survivor. And we're flying this recovery plane. Actually, Colt is flying the recovery plane now, and it doesn't land. And we add on recovery after recovery. So to try to fix that in a comprehensive way is no small task, and maybe even impossible, right? You have to be realistic about it. Because if you want to do comprehensive reform, you still have to deal with 22 years of ongoing disasters that we're still doing, or more, right? You have to figure that out. And then you have to pass comprehensive disaster at some point in time and draw a line in the sand. But I think, to Jeff's point, is we have to like get the political will to do something big, right? It's all Band-Aids, again, well-intentioned, but we need to have a big idea about really how to change the course of, again, it all comes down to the survivor. How do we make that experience much, much better than it is? How do we make it simpler? How do we make it faster? How do we save taxpayers dollars? Because the burn on FEMA employees or contractors supporting disasters is eye-watering, right? Could you cut that down, and could you have a more simplified process to take care of a state's disaster, right? But we have to think big about it. I don't think we just think in small little bites. But Congress needs to get their act together on that, because there's going to come a point in time where we're going to be up against a wall.
Yeah. Well, and is it bad policy? I look at David Bebo and Colt, two of the brightest minds in emergency management here. Is it bad policy, or is it really a legislative fix that needs to be made? How are we going through and understanding like this is really poor policy? And then it causes members of Congress who want to rewrite a bill to fix a bad policy rather than fix the policy, right? And again, you got to be very careful. Like if you want to consolidate HUD funds to FEMA or whatever else, just hypothetically, it better become outfitted with the people to manage that, because FEMA doesn't have the capacity. And as Jeff was saying, I go into office and 2 months later we get hit with Harvey, Irma, Maria. The country goes 11 or 12 years without a major landfall and hurricane. The last one was Wilma in 2005. I go into office and 2 months later and we get nailed left and right? And if FEMA was a car engine, we were redlining in Hurricane Harvey, and I don't think we've ever stopped to come off that red line, right? And so you got to be careful just strapping new parts to that rusty old bicycle, that framework, because you're just continuing to stress that system. And when you look at the disaster declaration, the process, I mean, the fact that some states can get a disaster declaration for less than $2 million of uninsured losses, we should be scratching our head on that a little bit and going, hold on a minute. For FEMA to administer $2 million to that disaster, the overhead cost is more than the grant funding that we're kicking out to manage some of these small disasters. And if you throw out Maria, and David could probably correct me if I was wrong, he told me a stat one time that, and I may get this wrong, but 50% of the disasters that FEMA declares are less than $7.5 million. Think about that on average. This was before I got into office. And then 80% of the disasters that FEMA declares was less than $41 million. You sit there and you go, why is this threshold so low? Or should we throw out the threshold because it doesn't really mean anything, this uninsured threshold? It doesn't really mean anything when citizens are like, people are in need, right? So we need to rethink that whole process, and I think that could remove some of the weight off of FEMA's shoulders.
And I don't think, I'm not going to disagree with everything Brock said, but let's. Let's do that. Let's do that.
That's fine.
That way. I mean, his stats are there, and I've seen it and lived it. But let's go back to the previous question. How do you think states would react and Congress would react if the law was changed to change what Brock is advocating for? Do you think any congressman is going to get behind increasing that cost share to put more cost burden on the state? Do you think a governor's going to stand up and say, that's a great idea?
But I'm not saying increase the cost share. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying throw it out. Throw it out.
Hear me out. That may be a great thought, but to go back to Andy's point, I don't see how you ever put that into play without what Pete said, the really political will to say, hey, we've got to change this, and we're going to make some people really, really upset.
So let's take this, and we'll dumb this down.
Are we taking turns?
Pete,
yeah, sure.
You want to go?
No. Ask another question.
You don't want to stick on this?
No, yeah, real quick.
Okay.
If Pete's a local director in Providence and he just needs a bottle of water, whatever happened, he needs a bottle of water, he can't get one. He's gone to county mutual aid. There's no bottles of water in Rhode Island to be found. He goes to the governor, and the governor doesn't have any bottles of water either because their capacity's gone. The federal government's sitting on billions and billions and billions of bottles of water, but they're not going to give Pete one because he didn't meet an uninsured infrastructure loss threshold. That's our disaster declaration process summed up in
Fair enough.
a minute.
I want to go back to workforce.
Yeah.
Because,
Great.
again, the people at FEMA are the ones who have to administer all of this to fulfill all of these missions, all of these overlapping missions. And they're held to account publicly, right? If you think about the federal government, FEMA is a highly visible agency and held by the public to account for disasters, even when it's not their responsibility or the public doesn't really understand FEMA's role in a disaster. So I want to get back to how do you recruit and retain the people that we need to man all of these positions to be able to effectively fulfill this mission? And what are the tools needed to be able to recruit those people?
So when Brock asked me to go on this detail as a deputy administrator,
I'm sorry.
yeah, my interest was to become the agency's chief operating officer to try to fix some of these things. So and I have a lot of pet peeves when it comes to the business of FEMA, not necessarily how we deliver disaster resources, but how we run FEMA as a business, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to recruiting, we have a small recruiting team, right, that does that. But we need to really think about how we recruit and where we recruit and why we're recruiting, right? So the way we get people at FEMA, and it's probably the same with emergency managers organizations across the nation, is good people find us because they like the mission that we have, helping people before, during, and after disasters. Good people find us, and thank God, because we have some of the greatest employees at FEMA that I've ever met. But that system is flawed, because someday maybe the good people don't want to show up anymore, maybe because all the reasons that Jeff said, burnout, and hey, it's a tough business. But we need to be out, FEMA, recruiting in all the places that everyone else is recruiting. So if you want to add diversity to FEMA, you have to be out recruiting diversity. You just can't hope that the right people at the right time come to ask for a job. You've got to be out there doing it every day. And we should be recruiting the smartest people in the country. We need to be out there doing that every single day. And then, right, once you get them, you have to have a plan to retain them. And I'm not sure we do a great job in retention. And I think part of the challenge is because the job is so demanding and there's no end in sight, right? There's no, the wildfire season is earthquake season is every day, right? Wildfire season is every month. And I tell people that as a FEMA administrator, there's something happening every day, every minute, right? So there's no ups and downs.
Right.
But you have to have a system to retain really good people. Whether that's a defined career path so they can see where they start and where they want to end. Maybe they come in as a GS5, they want to be an SES, and you can show them that career path. And then maybe you need to rotate them out of really high demand jobs, right? And you're going to put them in a lower impact job, still working at FEMA, or maybe working at another agency for a break. But we have to be deliberate about all that, because it doesn't matter, how much stuff we have in warehouses. It doesn't really matter the policy. If we don't have really good people ready to deliver, right, the resources to the nation when it most needs it, we will fail. And that is the secret sauce of FEMA. The secret sauce of FEMA is its employees.
Yeah,
Agree, 100%.
So I think if I could wave my wand, or I could have gutted it out for 4 years or whatever, we were working on a process to change the hiring. We wanted to change the hiring process. We wanted to blow it up, because the problem with FEMA is that they advertise every job across the agency. And so you're bringing people in from the outside that have never stepped a day out in the disaster arena, managing some of the most important programs. And I often joke of, we hired a lot of people. For example, let's just say after Katrina, there was this big push to hire everybody out of the Coast Guard. Phenomenal people, right? But you can't hire somebody out of the Coast Guard and say, congratulations, we'd like you to run FEMA recovery. And if I was a former FEMA administrator going to the Coast Guard and I wanted to fly helicopters, they wouldn't even let me touch that helicopter until I went through basic training. Right? And so I think that when you look at the way that FEMA's designed, one of the things that the three of us did is we implemented the FEMA integration teams. We were trying to get staff out of these regional offices and out of headquarters, embed them with state agencies, and then you redesign the entire hiring process and turn Emmitsburg into Quantico for emergency management. You hire in academy classes of 100, And when we, in 17, we didn't have enough bilingual FEMA agents to send to Puerto Rico, Florida, Texas, and California. So what if I could hire 200 people? I don't care what your background is or where you're from. We're going to send you to Emmitsburg to become an emergency manager, and then we're going to send you, once you've been educated about it, we're going to send you out to a fit team to learn what local emergency managers go through and how the federal government comes down, right? And then they apply to a FEMA region, and then if they're good there, then they go to a FEMA headquarters, and you have some job rotation. But right now, people can't move up inside the agency because people are sliding in all over FEMA, but that's not how it works at the FBI. It's not how it works at Secret Service. That's not how it works in public safety agencies. FEMA's got to fix that. Congress has got to fix that for FEMA.
Yes.
FEMA knows it.
So I want to turn to Jeff. A little bit different kind of a topic building on that. It isn't just FEMA employees, right? There are organizations like yours, nonprofits like Team Rubicon, who play a really important role post-disaster and long before it. I wonder if you can talk about how FEMA can kind of more strategically take advantage of nonprofit organizations, state and local governments. Like, where do we really divide responsibility, and how can we make sure that those roles are more appropriately kind of allocated?
Yeah,
in this
great question, Andy, and yeah, I'd love to take that one. So, I think it's been said before up here, disaster response, disaster recovery is a team sport, right? It's not, FEMA may be on the front or forefront of that from an optic standpoint, but they're not. The locals are the forefront of it. The locals are the ones that are dealing with the problems, that are dealing with it firsthand. And then there's a support mechanism, and generally 99% of the times that system, it does. FEMA supporting states, whether it's right, wrong, and how that happens, it happens. But a couple of ways, tangible ways that I've seen and really applaud FEMA and the state. So when we come in, when Team Rubicon comes into a community, one of our priorities is we are not going to be a logistical burden to that community. We're not going to take up hotel space from disaster survivors. We're not going to take up food, water, and those necessary supplies from disaster survivors. Part of that is our military heritage, and part of it is the right thing to do. So one of the challenges, and we primarily work on homes, we try to, I tell people our goal is to help get survivors out of disaster shelters by rapidly repairing their home. And we've got partners in the audience that help us do that. But billeting, or where we house our volunteers, generally would be like at a veteran of foreign wars place, a gym, YMCA, wherever we can find it. I've got a mobile capability now. We may be sleeping in fields. That'll be fun. But we'll do that. My team likes that. So, but one of the things, and we saw it in Hurricane Ian in Florida, that was really just a game changer for us, was our ability to work with FEMA and the state to house our gray shirts in the station, the camps. I forget what we call it. I can't believe it.
Band camps.
Yeah.
Or person camps.
Yeah, right.
Camps.
Base camps. That's what
Base
I'm looking for. Good
Base
Lord. Base camps. So what that allowed us to do, and how we kind of determine our exit strategy, is if we have volunteer availability, meaning we still got gray shirts that want to get down range, and we have adequate housing, we'll stay in that community as we did in Hurricane Ian well into the next year. So being able to, I would ask FEMA and employ that they, especially on the large disasters, really look at that, because we can help you with housing. I can go places the federal government can never go, called private property. I can also, and not me, our gray shirts, it's not Jeff Byard, it's Team Rubicon. We can do a lot of things that can help, FEMA get their system going, that can help a state, and it's been proven time and time again. And it's not just Team Rubicon; it's all the partners that come to help. We bring maybe 5 things to a disaster survivor who needs 100 things. So it's about partnership. Yeah. So I think the base camp, and then I'll say this: bring Valor back. Valor was awesome. I had a hand in that. Starting it, had a hand in shutting it down, but and Colt, may kick me after this one, but the ability, and in certain areas, right, the ability to have the supplies necessary, and we have great partners on Team Rubicon side that can get the building supplies, but the shipping of that, if it's really restricted, it can be a very valuable asset. We bring a lot of skilled volunteers that are passionate, to the team. So I think those are two tangibles that I would say.
And maybe a little description of the emergency management enterprise, right? Because I think a lot of people just associate emergency management with organizations, agencies that have emergency in their name, and it's much broader than that. It's volunteer organizations, VOADs, NGOs, nonprofits, the private sector. Many people overlook how important the private sector is. Now that I'm in the private sector, we're all two of us in the private sector. You really see how the private sector is truly part of, especially a response and a long-term recovery. So it's just not FEMA, right? And it's just not our mission partners like DOD and Corps of Engineers, right? It's really all of government, because without the entire team, right, from the single volunteer that volunteered today, up until the DOD sent in a carrier battle group to Puerto Rico. Without that entire team, it doesn't happen. It does not happen. So it's much bigger than FEMA. We are the kind of maybe the kingpin in the middle of that, but it's a big machine that needs to be integrated and coordinated. And that's how these big problems get overcome.
The nonprofit organizations are the glue that try to help catch the people that are falling through the cracks. And the reason that there's cracks is because the disaster declaration, the programs that are offered to communities is inconsistent. So, a local emergency manager or a mayor has no idea what to expect after a disaster, because the tools are always constantly changing, coming in and out of the toolbox. Is HUD coming to town or not? Are we getting HUD dollars? How do we plan for things appropriately? Because there's a lack of consistency in the programs that come, and there needs to be a simplification. I mean, I've gotten to the point where I would approve IA. Why is there such thing as an IA and a PA? You either have a disaster declaration or you don't, and it should come with all its parts or not. And so why turn off IA if the community really needs it? Because they didn't meet some arbitrary number of uninsured homes in a community or whatever else. The infrastructure is already there. You got people sitting in Denton, you got people sitting in Winchester waiting to take that 1-800-621 FEMA call. Why not utilize it? You're paying for it. It's there. Turn it on, and then help. And then the local governments. Here's the other thing, though. Why do some states not have their own form of IA? Why do some states not have their own form of PA? Should they pay a higher cost share until they get it right? I mean, at some point, I don't want to be heavy-handed, but there has to be a standard that local and state governments can service their own people before the federal government's got to step in.
So
Andy, real quick, just for the audience and the ones online, you may not know, Individual Assistance is the IA program that helps individuals after a disaster. It's this program. Public Assistance helps repair public infrastructure bridge. That's how I didn't want to. We can acronym this thing to death in FEMA, so trust me.
It's good that you brought your interpreter here today.
Yeah. So in just a couple minutes, I'm going to turn to audience questions, so please get them ready. I wanted to stick with you, Pete, because in your current role at Hill International and at FEMA, a huge priority is mitigation. It's preparedness. It's not post-disaster. It's preventing worse outcomes. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit, because we haven't really touched on it yet, about how you appropriately balance, that emergency response boots on the ground mission that is what we think of as FEMA versus really putting money into preventing these things from being such disasters in the first place.
Yeah, I think one of the things I always had an issue with from a local emergency manager to a state emergency manager, and especially as a FEMA administrator, is globally we don't put enough money into preparedness. When you look at what we spend on preparedness, even preparedness grants, right? Homeland Security grants, EMPG grants, against everything else we spend money on, like recovery and disasters. It's a really small percentage of our investment in preparedness, things like Brock was talking about before. I think if you really want to change the game a little bit, right, you really have to invest more upfront. And again, that's mitigation, right? And this is I think we all agree on pre-disaster investments. It makes much better sense to invest more money upfront because there's not going to be a time where we're going to say no about responding to a long-term recovery or a complicated response. FEMA will do whatever it needs to do for its citizens to make sure that we're doing their best for them. So money is not an issue in a big response, but could we offset that money by preparing states, locals, tribes, territories, individuals, private sector to invest more in preparedness so the impact down the road is less, right? I think that's the whole goal of mitigation and resilience. But we need again, we just have to take a look at where our money is going, right? And it's going in recovery. That's where all the money is, and it's unsustainable. When you think about the course we've been on, more intense, more disasters, more frequent, more costly. If you're on that following that track, at some point it becomes unaffordable and maybe unachievable to actually respond because you can't afford it all. So again, I think more money up front, whether it's mitigation, resilience efforts, preparedness efforts, we need to do more of that.
So when it comes to
For questions,
what's that?
just a couple quick points before we turn to audience questions.
Yeah, so one thing on citizen preparedness, I don't feel like our campaigns are very effective. I mean, for example, are we really asking people to be prepared for 5 days, or should we ask them to put that money towards being properly insured? There's a big need for financial resiliency education starting at a very young age and helping people understand how money works. Tangible skills rather than just saying go buy supplies for 5 days. I don't think that's effective. But when it comes to the mitigation of the country, one of the things that we advocated for was BRIC, and I testified numerous times on more mitigation funding. But you can't just say $1 of mitigation is worth, saves us $7. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if I really believe that. But because if that's the case, then why is everything escalating cost-wise in disaster recovery? But the BRIC program specifically was designed to understand and identify what's the infrastructure that's got to be working. If it's not working, people are dying and life routine is disrupted, right? Identify who owns it, and then how does the federal government and FEMA start to work with them to fix the things that have to be working, like energy, hospitals, communications, safety, security, whatever it may be, transportation. And until we start to put national campaigns on this year, we're going to focus on energy and comms and fortifying these things. Then you can't tell Congress a comprehensive story on how well the mitigation dollars are actually doing. And we've never been able to do that because mitigation in this country is piecemealed by 50 state one-off plans. And what are we all striving for? How are we buying down risk with the mitigation dollars collectively to fortify the infrastructure that we need to work?
So with that,
Real quick, Andy, mitigation works. That's
yep, sure
It does work. Yeah.
So if you're watching online, please, you can submit questions via the chat, and they'll pop up on my screen magically. And we have Rebecca walking around with a mic if anyone in the audience has a question. Jennifer, and please stand up so people online can see you.
Oh, then I'm going to, is it on? Or should I just be loud? I could do that.
Do both.
Oh, okay. I can be loud, and I don't know that it's on. So I'm Jennifer Gray Thompson. I run a nonprofit called After the Fire. I represent mega fire communities since 2017. 2015 was kind of our intro, like maybe this is bad in Lake County. Since 2017, about 70 million acres have burned in this country and over 70,000 structures. We are hurting. And we are also hurting I love FEMA. I know what they do. A big part of my job is actually to go into these communities and help the local government, NGOs, and private sector actually figure out what do you do? What does the local agency, what's everybody's roles? And then I stay with them for years. But because we are the newbies, the babies, we are not hurricanes, we are not wind and rain, we are actually solvable, which is a whole interesting conversation around mitigation. But I would like to hear from you about your experience in megafire, how FEMA has changed. Maui is probably our biggest game changer and our biggest opportunity, and I'm worried that we're going to miss it. We can rebuild their housing structure for the next 100 years or 50 years, and we're doing, FEMA's doing a good job. They're bending, but there's so much more to do. The magical thinking piece of disaster has not been solved. Marketing is a big part of that. influencing is a huge part of that. And finally, I would really like to talk about the role of AI and how it could actually improve the process. So even I would like Haggerty to have a smaller job, and I think that we can probably agree with that. I would like the consultants to have a smaller job. I want a TurboTax model. I work with really small rural communities. Even Maui is really, really stretched for capacity. So it makes my job huge as a nonprofit, and I'm happy to partner with, but I would really like to hear what your thoughts are specific to megafire, because we don't have any blue roofs to tarp. There's nothing to gut. We're done. That's it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it is a hard problem to solve. And I'm going to go back to my local start as an emergency manager. And one of the first things I learned is that if you really want to make change, meaningful change about where you build, how you build, it all starts with local building codes and zoning rules and regulations. And FEMA has incentivized that recently. I think that there's some money to incentivize updating local building codes. But the challenge is, like, FEMA can't mandate building codes in a state or a local. They can only champion building codes. And so if you want to solve the problem, and this is like one of the hottest problems to solve. No one wants to change their building codes or their zoning rules because this is where they've lived. No matter if they live in a fire impacted area or a area that has a high risk of fire. No one wants to move. No one wants to cut down more trees. It's a hard thing to do. No one wants to move away from the ocean because where's my view got to go, right? So if you want to change the outcome, right, you got to get locals to change building codes and zoning laws. That's really the only way to make meaningful long-term change. You can go to, and I'm gonna pick Mexico Beach after Michael. Mexico Beach, I think, had one of the worst building codes pre-Michael, and then they realized after the disaster, because that's when everyone gets Jesus, right? After the disaster, they didn't realize that they needed to change these codes before the disaster, but I think that's human nature. So now Mexico Beach has one of the strongest building codes in the nation, only because they had a disaster. You got to change that dynamic, right? I'm not sure how you do it, but it's going to start with local mayors and town managers and city councils. You got to go in there and demand that they change the way we allow people where to build and how to build.
We don't meaningfully go through AARs, after action reports. We declare victory and move on. We're stuck in this response cycle. And I look at Jeff because I get cracked up. We went through H1N1 together, and we were asked by public health to activate all our plans, and we had a big response bill to move all of our supplies out to these regional distribution sites, and there was nobody there to pay the bill when we had done it. And fast forward, like, we put that forward and never went anywhere, and then you fast forward to COVID, for example. When you look at all these, and then what you're talking about too is, on the insurance piece, step away from Paradise, California is the worst thing I've ever seen in my career. And but what were the after action points that have just disappeared, immediately after the fire, and then we move on to the next fire, and then we try to piecemeal things together. But on Pete's point, one of the things that's happening now is that you have this mass migration to like Florida or wherever else, where people are selling a home up north, and they're going down and they're buying a house for cash, and they're not putting insurance on their biggest chunk of wealth, and they don't realize what they're buying. They might be buying something that was built before 2001, before the Florida building codes changed, and guess what? The hurricane comes and wipes them out, and they want FEMA recovery to make them whole again. And the agency's not designed to do that. So there's education processes with, we've got to form better friendships in emergency management with the reinsurance industry. We have not chastise them, not point the finger and blame them, for leaving or whatever else. We need to understand how to get them back to the table. We need, local elected officials don't get elected by passing building codes, but how do we start to incentivize that through less cost share or whatever else? I mean, there's all kinds of things that we need to do. How do we engage the real estate agencies and the realtors associations to say, hey, stop saying that this house doesn't require FEMA flood insurance when any house in America can flood, right? So some of these things, we've got to change and bolster our friendships and
Jennifer, I think, to your question, and I know you're passionate about it, and I appreciate that, and really do. I think just tangible, from the rebuild of Maui and communities, really not in my wheelhouse. But I do know that mitigation work specifically around wildfires. I also know that for a long part, and a lot of kind of like hurricanes in the southeast and in the East Coast, a lot of people out west say that's just that problem. Now we're seeing more fires. We've just completed a couple of mitigation operations on our side in Florida and Texas. So I think elevating, the threat, across that and really getting that, but you gotta, work with those local communities, and it kind of goes back to preparedness. Look, nobody walks in anybody else's shoes. I don't know what their situations are, but I feel like it's our responsibility and on the emergency to at least so they know the hazards. They can do with it what they will on that, but what are those true hazards? How do we mitigate not just, the standard, but if it's a alert, alert notification system, make sure that's there, make sure that we know how to use it, make sure that the citizens know what the right messaging is on that. So I think there is some tangible things that we can learn out of the Maui fire and apply that across the board.
It does have to be equitable and affordable, though. I do want to say this, that kind of doing those things is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And making it so it's not taxed would be great. Any kind of, you can do a home for $10,000. You can pretty much save it a lot of the time, even in Maine fire. But it costs $10,000, and that means that wealthy people will protect their homes. In the communities that I work with often that are rural and frontier, there's no money to do it. They can afford it.
So I'm going to go to a question online. We only have 3 minutes left, so let's do these rapid fire. How can FEMA best support local emergency responders in providing with the basic tools that they need for disaster response? I know, Jennifer, you work with communities. They're trying to be mayor, trying to be city planner, trying to be emergency responder at the same time.
Go to the Emergency Management Institute. Some of the best training and learning you'll get, very low cost to low to no cost. Take advantage of it. Any course you want to know for emergency management is generally housed or taught in that way. Take advantage of that. Take advantage of those that's been here. Reach out, build your network.
And I would just say, as a local emergency manager, you have, how can FEMA help us? I get that. But as a local emergency manager or a state emergency manager, you have an obligation as the emergency management director to build your program in your jurisdiction to the maximum extent possible, right? Whether you have FEMA money or you don't have FEMA money, your responsibility is to build that program to a level that you're generally happy with, and maybe you can't ever get there. But if you have a plan where, if you're a local, to say, well, my plan is I'm just going to call the state, that's a bad plan. If you're the state and says my plan is going to call FEMA, that's a bad plan. So, yes, we'll be there to help, but this is a equal opportunity kind of enterprise here. You have to do all in your power to build your program at whatever level to the highest standard that you can. And then, we're all a stronger nation. But to say, you're coming to help us and we'll just wait for you, that is a bad plan, my friends.
So I think FEMA should actually, through either procurement, response, and recovery, help communities set up Blue Sky Day contracts that will bolster their capability. It doesn't require more FEMA staff. You hire support when you don't have the technical expertise to get the job done, or you don't have the staff to run the disaster, or you don't have the equipment. Help them set up Blue Sky Day contracts to bring in the private sector to bolster the capability. And FEMA's got to realize that they can't do it all. They don't have to do it all, that there are ways of utilizing the current laws and policies to get cities and counties and states help.
Any other quick questions from the room?
Just one comment, actually.
With the mic, and if you could stand up, that would be great.
With the local emergency managers, though, I don't think that they're understanding the amount of funding that's actually out there now. When you talk about mitigation efforts and you look at the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a tremendous amount of funding out there. You talk to the local emergency managers, they don't understand how to access those funds.
You're
so
right.
It's an education that needs to occur that's not currently there.
So after Katrina, we focused a lot on incident command, and there's still all these standards on NIMS compliance around incident command. But a local emergency manager needs grants administrators, and they need certifications in project management. I don't really believe they are the incident command manager over a whole lot, as much as they are a coordinator bringing people together. But right now, nobody understands what they're entitled to from the federal government, not just from a disaster recovery standpoint, but from an IIJA standpoint. Nor do they have the capacity to go after that funding, get it, execute it, and do their day job. So help them understand what they're entitled to, how to streamline all that funding together. But then again, where's the national conversation on how we utilize all that funding to buy down risk and become more resilient? It doesn't exist.
So with that, we are out of time as expected. Would you join me in giving our panelists a round of applause? So thank you all for being
The suit
here. Have
matches
a great day.